At 30,000 feet, both pilots suddenly blacked out. No warning. No time to think. Just silence in the cockpit. Then, a 12-year-old girl stood up from her seat. She walked forward, sat down, and took the controls. What she did next shocked everyone on board, and the whole world watching later. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Ava Bennett loved planes more than anything else. She was only 12 years old, but she already knew how a jet engine worked. She could explain the steps a pilot follows in an emergency. Her room was full of small model planes hanging from the ceiling. On her tablet, she had a very detailed flight simulator app. She had used it for more than 600 hours. She had practiced takeoffs, landings, and even engine failures again and again. Her father, David Bennett, often said she probably knew more about flying than most people who had never sat in a real cockpit. That morning, Ava and her father were flying from Seattle to Chicago. They were going to celebrate her grandmother's 80th birthday. The flight was supposed to be simple, just under 4 hours in the air. Ava was extra excited for one more reason. The plane was a Boeing 737-800. This was the exact same plane model she had flown so many times on her simulator. She wanted to see how close the real cockpit sounds and cabin felt to the one she already knew so well. They reached the airport early and checked their bags without any problem. David smiled as he watched his daughter point at different planes parked outside. She could tell one plane apart from another just by looking at the wingtips. Before boarding, Ava even asked a gate agent if she could peek inside the cockpit. The agent laughed kindly and said the captain was busy right now, but maybe next time. Inside the plane, Ava and her father sat in seats 14A and 14B, a window and an aisle seat near the middle of the cabin. Ava looked out the window and watched workers loading bags into the plane below. A flight attendant named Rosa walked by and noticed how excited Ava looked. She asked if Ava liked planes, and Ava said she loved them more than anything. Rosa smiled and told her that if she behaved well, maybe the captain would say hello to her over the speaker. The safety video played, and the plane slowly backed away from the gate. As they moved toward the runway, Ava listened closely to the pilot's voice. His name was Captain Rios. He sounded calm and sure of himself. He said the weather was clear and the flight should take about 3.5 hours. Ava closed her eyes for a second and imagined herself sitting up front, hands on the controls, guiding the plane down the runway. The engines roared, and the plane sped down the runway before lifting smoothly into the sky. Ava watched the ground get smaller and smaller until it disappeared under a layer of clouds. Once the seatbelt light turned off, people around her relaxed. Some read books, some put on headphones, and some fell asleep. It felt like any normal flight Ava had taken before with her father. About 40 minutes into the flight, while the plane was flying steady at 30,000 feet, something changed. Ava happened to look toward the front of the plane just as a flight attendant carried a tray of coffee to the cockpit door. The door opened for a second, and in that moment, Ava saw the co-pilot rubbing his eyes and shaking his head, as if he could not see clearly. At first she thought he was just tired. But a few seconds later, she saw him slump down in his seat. David was sitting next to her, looking at his phone, and had not noticed anything. Ava tapped his arm and told him something looked wrong up front. He looked up, confused, and asked what she meant. Before she could explain, the flight attendant who had carried the coffee rushed back down the aisle. Her face was pale. She disappeared into the small kitchen area. A moment later, her voice came shaking over the speaker, asking if anyone on the plane had experience flying an aircraft to please come to the front right away. The cabin went quiet for a second before people started whispering. Some passengers thought it was a joke. Others were scared and confused. David turned to Ava, worried, not sure what was going on. Ava's heart began to beat fast. She understood right away what that message probably meant. Every hour she had spent studying flight books and practicing on her simulator now felt like it had been leading to this exact moment. She turned to her father and said she needed to go up there. She told him she knew this exact plane model, and that she might be able to help. David stared at her, shocked, unable to believe what she was saying. He told her this was not a game, that she could not just walk into a cockpit during a real flight. Ava said she knew it was not a game, but that someone had to try, and she was the only person on this plane who had studied this exact aircraft for years. The flight attendant's voice came over the speaker again, even more worried, repeating the same request. Ava unbuckled her seatbelt before her father could stop her. She stood up in the aisle, her knees shaking a little, and looked back at him one last time. He hesitated, scared but somehow also sure about his daughter, and finally gave a small nod. Ava turned and walked toward the front of the plane. Rows of passengers stared at her in confusion as she passed them and walked toward the cockpit door. When she reached the front, Rosa looked at her, shocked and desperate. She asked where Ava's parents were. Ava quickly explained that she had studied this exact plane for years and understood how it worked. Rosa paused for only a second before letting her in, because there was really no other choice. Inside, both Captain Rios and the co-pilot were slumped in their seats. They were not moving. Their faces were pale, and their breathing was slow and weak. A small warning light was blinking on the panel above, but the autopilot still seemed to be holding the plane steady for now. Ava asked Rosa to help her move the two men out of their seats. Together, they carefully unbuckled the pilots and moved them to the small seats behind the controls. Ava climbed into the captain's seat. Her feet barely reached the pedals. The screens and buttons in front of her felt more real and more solid than anything on her tablet, but the layout matched almost exactly what she had memorized. She looked at the altitude, speed, and direction on the screens, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She reached for the radio, pressed the button, and said that this was the plane in trouble, that both pilots were unconscious, and that she needed help right away. There was a short pause before a voice answered. The person on the radio asked her to repeat who was speaking, confused by the young voice. Ava explained that her name was Ava Bennett, that she was 12 years old, and that she was now sitting in the captain's seat because both pilots had passed out. There was a longer pause this time. Then a woman named Karen Alvarez answered in a calm, steady voice. She told Ava that she was going to help her through every step. In the control room on the ground, Karen quickly told her boss and the people near her what was happening. Within seconds, other workers gathered around her desk, listening in shock as they understood what was really happening. Karen leaned closer to her microphone and asked Ava to tell her the plane's current height and speed. Ava read the numbers off the screen, and Karen confirmed that they matched what she could see on her own radar. She told Ava she was doing a great job staying calm. Karen explained that they would guide the plane to a smaller airport with a long runway and less traffic. This would be safer for someone who had never flown a real plane before. She asked Ava to find the panel that controlled height and direction, and to check that it was still holding the plane steady. Ava found it right where she expected and said everything looked stable for now, though she admitted she was scared. Karen's voice grew softer. She told Ava that being scared was normal, and even useful, as long as it did not stop her from thinking clearly. She asked Ava to set a new direction that would slowly turn the plane toward the smaller airport. Ava carefully turned the dial, and the plane gently leaned to one side as it began to turn. The feeling of the plane turning under her hands was different from her simulator, heavier and more real, but the basic idea still felt familiar enough to keep her steady. Back in the main cabin, passengers grew more worried as rumors spread about what was happening up front. David sat gripping the arms of his seat, his mind racing with fear for his daughter, unable to see what was happening behind the closed door. Rosa walked through the aisle, trying to keep passengers calm, telling them the situation was being handled, though she did not say who was actually flying the plane, afraid it would cause panic. A man near the front stood up and asked loudly what was going on, saying something did not feel right. Rosa calmly asked him to sit back down and said trained staff were handling the problem, though her voice shook a little as she said it. David heard pieces of the conversation and felt his chest tighten with worry for what his daughter was facing alone on the other side of that door. Inside the cockpit, a warning sound suddenly went off. Ava looked at the fuel screen and saw that fuel was draining faster from one side of the plane than the other. She remembered this problem from her simulator training and told Karen right away. Karen calmly walked her through turning a valve that would move fuel between the two sides and fix the imbalance. Ava's hands were steady as she made the adjustment, and she watched with relief as the fuel levels began to even out. Just a few minutes later, the cabin lights flickered and got dimmer. Ava noticed the power reading on one of her screens had dropped. She told Karen about this new problem, and Karen told her to switch on the backup power system to steady the electricity. Ava found the right switch and flipped it. The light steadied, and the screen returned to normal. Karen told her she was handling these problems better than many trained pilots would under this kind of pressure. The small compliment gave Ava a quick burst of confidence. As the plane kept turning and dropping in height toward the smaller airport, Ava noticed something worrying on the cabin pressure screen. The number was lower than it should be at this height, and she suddenly realized this might explain why both pilots had passed out so quickly. She told Karen, who confirmed that low air pressure could make a person's brain not get enough oxygen, which can make someone pass out or feel very confused within minutes. Karen asked Ava how she was feeling, worried that Ava herself might also be affected by the low oxygen. Ava said she felt clear-headed and alert, though she admitted she had felt a little dizzy earlier before it passed. Karen told her to keep an oxygen mask nearby just in case, and kept guiding her through the steps to bring the plane down slowly to a safer height where the air would be normal again. Ava switched the speaker to talk to the whole cabin. She told the passengers that the cabin pressure had been low, and asked everyone to stay in their seats and use their oxygen masks if they felt dizzy or short of breath. Her voice, though young, sounded surprisingly steady. Some passengers later said it had a calming effect on them, even though many did not yet know a child was speaking to them from the cockpit. Rosa went back into the cabin and quietly told a few nearby passengers, including David, that a young girl was now flying the plane with help from air traffic control. Hearing this said out loud made David's fear jump even higher, but a strange pride mixed in with the fear too, because he knew that if anyone on this plane could try something like this, it would be his daughter. Passengers around him reacted with shock, fear, and a small bit of hope, some praying quietly, others holding hands with strangers next to them. As the plane dropped through 24,000 feet, Karen guided Ava through the landing checklist. She told her to lower the flaps slowly and reduce speed to get ready to land. Ava followed each step carefully, moving the flap lever and the throttle just like she had practiced so many times before, even though her hands shook a little with the weight of knowing this was real and she could not simply restart if something went wrong. Suddenly, a sharp warning tone rang out, and the autopilot turned off on its own. The steering wheel in front of Ava jerked slightly as full control passed to her hands. Her heart jumped into her throat, and for one moment, fear almost took over. Karen's voice cut in right away, calm but firm, telling her to grab the controls now, keep her hands steady, and use light pressure on the foot pedals just like she had practiced in her simulator. Ava gripped the controls firmly, feeling the plane respond to her hands in a way that felt both familiar and scary at the same time. The plane wobbled a little before steadying under her control, and she told Karen that she now had full manual control. Karen praised her calmly and kept guiding her through the rest of the steps for landing. Through the front window, Ava finally saw the lights of the small airport's runway glowing far ahead. Karen told her that emergency trucks were already waiting by the runway, ready to help the moment the plane landed safely. When Karen told her to, Ava lowered the landing wheels, feeling the heavy thud as they dropped and locked into place, shown by 3 green lights on her screen. As the plane dropped through 5,000 feet, a strong gust of wind pushed against the plane, making it drift slightly off the center of the runway. Ava, almost without thinking, moved the foot pedals to fix the drift, just like she had trained to do so many times. Karen praised her quick reaction and reminded her to keep her eyes on the center of the runway and not to overcorrect against the wind. The plane kept dropping, 1,000 feet, then 500, then closer and closer. Karen's voice stayed steady in her ear, telling her to gently pull back on the throttle and let the main wheels touch the ground first. Ava's palms were sweaty on the controls, but her focus stayed locked on the screens and the runway ahead. She quietly repeated the steps to herself, the same steps she had memorized so many times, determined not to let fear win now. At the last moment, Ava pulled back slightly on the wheel, lifting the nose just enough as the main wheels hit the runway in a firm but steady landing. The tires screeched, and the plane shook a little as its full weight settled onto the ground. Ava quickly turned on the engine brakes and pressed gently on the wheel brakes, just as she had practiced, feeling the plane slowly slow down along the long runway. Karen's voice came through the radio, full of relief and disbelief, confirming that the plane had landed safely. Cheers and cries of relief broke out across the cabin as passengers realized they were finally back on the ground. In the cockpit, Ava finally let out a long breath, her arms shaking from the strain of holding the controls steady through the whole flight down. Before the door opened, Captain Rios stirred a little in the small seat behind her, groaning as his eyes half opened. He mumbled, confused, asking what had happened. Ava turned briefly and told him he had passed out, and that she had brought the plane down safely. He blinked at her, clearly struggling to understand her words, before his eyes closed again as medics got ready to come aboard and take care of him. Ava turned back to her checklist, quietly finishing the last steps exactly as she had practiced hundreds of times at home, not letting herself feel anything yet until the plane was fully secure. A few rows behind David, a young couple sat frozen, holding each other's hands tightly. The woman kept whispering that everything would be fine, though her voice shook with every word. Her husband stared straight ahead at the closed cockpit door, trying to picture what could possibly be happening on the other side. An older man across the aisle closed his eyes and took slow, deep breaths, the way his doctor had once taught him to do during stressful moments. None of them knew that a 12-year-old girl was the only thing standing between them and disaster, but somehow, deep down, many of them felt a strange kind of calm settle over the cabin, as if some part of them sensed the danger was being handled with real skill. Rosa moved carefully down the aisle, checking on nervous passengers one by one, gently reminding them to keep their seatbelts fastened and to breathe slowly. She smiled at a small girl sitting near the wing, who was clutching a stuffed toy plane, completely unaware that another child not much older than her was flying the real one right now. Rosa found herself blinking back tears more than once, amazed at how the passengers, frightened as they were, still tried to comfort one another, strangers holding hands, parents whispering songs to their children, and quiet prayers passed silently from row to row as the plane continued its long, careful descent toward safety. The cockpit door opened moments later, and David rushed through, his eyes filled with tears as he saw his daughter still seated in the captain's chair, pale but unharmed. He pulled her into a tight hug, saying over and over how proud he was and how thankful he was that she was okay. Ava, still trying to understand everything that had just happened, could only nod against his shoulder, too overwhelmed to speak. Behind them, Rosa stood in the doorway, one hand on her chest, watching the two of them with a look somewhere between shock and gratitude. She later told investigators that she had worked as a flight attendant for 11 years and had never once imagined she would watch a 12-year-old girl calmly finish a shutdown checklist after landing a plane by hand. She said what stayed with her most was not the landing itself, but how quiet and focused Ava had stayed through every single alarm along the way. Out in the cabin, passengers slowly began to understand what had just happened. A woman near the back who had been holding a rosary through the whole descent finally breathed out and began to cry quietly with relief. A young boy asked his mother if the pilot had really been a kid. His mother, still shaking a little, said she honestly did not know, but that whoever it was had just saved all of their lives. Passengers stood up slowly, gathering their bags with shaky hands, many pausing to look toward the front of the plane as word spread about who had actually landed it. Paramedics rushed aboard to help the two pilots, who were slowly waking up, confused about what had happened. Investigators later found that a broken part in the pressure system had caused the air pressure in the cockpit to drop very fast. This caused both pilots to lose too much oxygen and pass out within minutes, while the main cabin's separate system had stayed mostly fine long enough to keep the passengers safe. As Ava stepped off the plane, she was met by a crowd of medics, airline staff, and soon, news crews who had already started gathering after word of the event spread online. Passengers walking off behind her spoke to reporters, describing in shock how a 12-year-old girl had calmly taken control of the plane and guided it to a safe landing after both pilots suddenly passed out. In the hours that followed, the story spread across news channels and social media everywhere. Videos and interviews from passengers went viral, with headlines calling Ava a young hero who had saved nearly 200 lives through calm thinking and years of practice. Karen Alvarez, the air traffic controller who had guided her through the whole event, also received a lot of praise for her steady help during the emergency. In the days that followed, Ava was asked to do many interviews, though the sudden attention often left her feeling tired and unsure. She quietly struggled with doubts about whether she had just gotten lucky, replaying the whole flight in her head and wondering if she really deserved all the praise she was getting. David noticed her going quiet during calm moments at home and gently encouraged her to talk about her feelings instead of keeping them inside. One evening, sitting together in their living room, David reminded Ava that even experienced pilots often doubt themselves after hard situations. He said what mattered most was not whether fear was there, but how a person chose to act despite that fear. Ava listened quietly, slowly starting to accept that what she had done that day was real and meaningful, even though she still felt unsure inside. In the months that followed, Ava went back to her flight simulator with new purpose. It was no longer just for fun, but real practice for a future she now felt sure she wanted. She began taking beginner flying lessons at a local flight school, working with an experienced teacher named Frank Doyle, a retired pilot who had heard her story and offered to teach her himself. Frank was unsure at first about teaching someone so young, but after their first lesson in a small training plane, he quickly saw that Ava had both the knowledge and the calm needed for serious flight training. Over the months that followed, Ava worked hard, treating each lesson not as something extra because of her fame, but as a real step toward learning a skill she had always loved. By the time she turned 14, Ava had completed her first solo flight in a small training plane, watched closely by her teacher. This meant far more to her than any of the news attention she had gotten after the first event. Frank told her afterward that she had truly earned her wings this time, not by chance, but through hard work and practice. Karen Alvarez stayed in touch with Ava through the years, sometimes visiting to check on her progress and cheer her on. During one visit, Karen told Ava that what she had done that day in the cockpit was not luck, but the direct result of years of practice meeting a moment that needed courage. Ava had come to understand this more clearly with each passing month of training. Years later, Ava Bennett became one of the youngest licensed commercial pilots in the country. She went on to study aviation safety, driven by her own experience with the pressure problem that had almost cost 2 pilots their lives. She spent much of her early career working to make cockpit safety systems better, hoping to stop similar problems from happening to others in the future. In her second year of flight training, Ava was invited to speak at a regional aviation safety meeting attended by pilots, air traffic controllers, and airline safety workers from across the country. Standing at a stage bigger than any classroom she had known, she described the flight not as an act of heroism, but as the result of thousands of quiet hours spent studying manuals and repeating simulator practice long after most people would have gotten bored. She told the crowd that her skill had not come from that one afternoon at 30,000 feet, but from every normal evening before it, when no one was watching and there was no emergency to prove anything. After her talk, several airline workers came up to her privately to talk about how her experience might help shape future training programs, especially around noticing early signs of cabin pressure problems and better ways to talk to passengers during in-flight emergencies. Investigators from the original event later said that details from Ava's own memory, including the exact order of warning lights she saw before the pilots passed out, helped improve how the airline checked their planes for worn-out pressure parts. Karen Alvarez, now known in her own field for staying calm while guiding a 12-year-old through a full emergency landing, began teaching newer controllers how to talk clearly and calmly during stressful moments. She often used recordings from that day, with permission, to show how simple, steady instructions could help even someone with no training do hard things safely under pressure. She and Ava stayed close over the years, sometimes meeting at aviation events, where Karen liked to introduce her simply as the calmest voice she had ever heard on a radio. Captain Rios, once fully recovered, asked to meet Ava privately a few weeks after the event. He told her he had studied the flight recordings closely and looked at exactly how she had responded to each problem while at the controls. He said that in more than 20 years of flying, he had trained co-pilots who reacted with less focus than she had shown as a 12-year-old facing her very first real emergency. Before she left, he gave her his own set of pilot wings, telling her he wanted her to have something real to remind her that what she did was not luck, but true skill under pressure. David, who had once feared the whole event might leave lasting damage on his daughter, instead watched her grow steadier and more focused with each passing year. He often said that the Ava who boarded that flight to Chicago had been a curious, dreaming child, but the Ava who walked off the plane afterward had already started the long, quiet process of becoming exactly who she was meant to be. He fully supported her training, driving her to early morning lessons before school and sitting through hours of ground classes just to be near her while she learned. By the time Ava reached her early 20s, she had earned her commercial pilot license and started working as a co-pilot for a regional airline, flying many of the same routes she had once only studied through her tablet simulator as a child. She kept a small laminated card in her flight bag with the tail number of that first plane and the date of the flight, not as a trophy, but as a quiet personal reminder of where her path in flying had truly begun. Sometimes, passengers recognized her name when boarding, having read about the event years earlier, and some would ask if she was really the same girl from the news story. Ava always answered honestly, telling them yes, but that the moment they remembered was only the beginning of a much longer journey that took years of steady, ordinary work to finish. She often added that anyone could learn to handle hard things under pressure, as long as they were willing to prepare long before the pressure ever came. Years later, during an interview about her career, Ava was asked what she remembered most clearly about that day above 30,000 feet. She said it was not the fear, though there had been plenty of it, and it was not the applause or the headlines that came after. What she remembered most was the exact moment she stood up from her seat and stepped into the aisle, not sure if she was making the right choice, but sure that waiting for someone else to act was no longer an option. She said that one decision, made in just a few seconds, quietly shaped every decision she made afterward, both in the cockpit and outside of it. The story of the flight slowly faded from the daily news, replaced by newer stories and other events, but for everyone who had been on that plane, and for Ava herself, the memory stayed with them forever. What started as a normal flight to a family celebration had turned, through an unbelievable mix of chance and years of preparation, into a moment that changed the course of a young girl's whole future, showing that sometimes, courage just needs the chance to come out.